to AAU TV. This is Diaspora Connect. This is the show where we explore issues of the linkages between the diaspora and their home country, Africa. We also look at how the diasporans can also help develop their home countries, Africa. We explore issues that make it easier for the diaspora to also come back to their home country to support in the developmental agenda of the continent in general. So today on Diaspora Connect, we are looking at the exposure of the African diaspora to contemporary African literature. And today in the house, I have an honorable person in the field of African literature who will help us dive into this issue. We'll go for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue with our discussions. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is Diaspora Connect on AAU TV. Today we are looking at the exposure of Africans in the diaspora to contemporary African literature on AAU TV. Remember, you can follow us on all our social media handles: on Facebook, Association of African Universities; on Twitter, AAU_67, and also you can follow our website, our live streaming website, that is AAU TV. And also on YouTube, you can catch us live and follow the discussions here on AAU TV. I'll be your host for today's show. Schenineda Kwaku Ankomah is my name. And today on Diaspora Connect, our guest is Dr. Kwadwo Osei-Nyame Jnr. So we welcome our guest. Doc, you are welcome to AAU TV.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion about African literature and African studies generally.
All right, so Doc, we are looking at the exposure of African diaspora to contemporary African literature. But then, before we talk about the African literature, let's start from the whole, that is African studies in general, of which the contemporary literature is a subset. So when we say African studies, which is a course that we know that we study at the university, what does it entail? If I say African studies as a layman, I think that African study is the study of Africa. What is there that falls beyond my layman's perspective?
The layman's perspective is also relevant, even though we'll expound on that. When you go to Legon, in our time when we went to Legon, something called African studies we did usually in the first year, just a series of subjects. But there's a broader field of study, which is global, which is worldwide, not just here in Ghana, in other parts of Africa, in the West, and the continent of Europe, in America, etc. And what it has come to be known as is African studies, specifically to deal with the history, the culture, the languages, the experiences of Africans and also people of African descent.
Okay.
So that you see that even right from the beginning, there's that connection between Africa and its diaspora. Okay. So you're talking about African studies, but you're not talking only about continental Africa, but you're talking also about Africa in the diaspora, okay, which means all the other African communities and nations in the diaspora. And it started generally as a protest against traditional curricula that were talking about Africa, because Africa has always been a subject of study.
Okay.
And that subject of study has been dominated by Europeans.
Okay.
But African studies came in as an intervention at a particular point, because the consensus was that the study of Africa, especially by all these leading institutions in the West, was very traditionally Eurocentric, okay, Euro-centered, which is to say that the ideas that were reproduced even in the study, the research and the teaching of Africa tilted towards Europe, making Europe the center of knowledge.
Okay.
So African studies came in as a branch of study, which has many branches, okay, so it's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, whatever you want to call it. But its main focus was to question the manner in which Africa had been represented up to a particular point in time. So, for example, in the 60s and the 70s, there were mass protests in the US, okay, saying all this scholarship that is going on about Africa isn't really African.
Okay.
And it has to do with broader questions of African existence, you know, how Africa has been represented in the narrative of the West. Because from the moment that Africa has been in history, Africa has been represented, but for a long time, you know, it was represented mainly by people who were not Africans.
Okay.
And they presented what practitioners of African studies or people who teach African studies consider to be stereotypes and, you know, misrepresentations of Africa. So there's that whole body of field. And so you have it in the literature, you have it in the philosophy, you have it in the humanities and the social sciences, you can have it in political science, you can have it in development studies. All of these are different branches of study that constitute African studies. But to sum it up in a sense, is that body of work, that body of research, that body of scholarship, which seeks to present Africa in its own proper right, in a way which is Africa-centered, which is say you're looking at it from the perspective of the African. Rather than from the European, for example, who's representing Africa. And so that's one way of looking at it, but it's a very wide, broad area of study.
Then that comes in the contemporary African literature, which is a branch of, say, the main African studies that you talked about.
Yes.
What does the contemporary African literature really say about Africa, or what does it seek to really do? Okay,
one of the things that contemporary African literature seeks to do is very basic.
Okay.
You know, to show African life as it is.
Okay.
You can start typically with a novel like Things Fall Apart.
Okay.
That is not the very beginning. You know, there are the earlier novels of people like Ethiopia, J.E. Kesley Hereford with Ethiopia Unbound, or Saul Blakey in South Africa with Moody. But let's take Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958, in which the writer of that novel, Chinua Achebe, said, look, I'm using this novel to show that Africa was not one long, dark night of savagery from which the first Europeans liberated us. And he talks in, you know, a series of interviews and in other writings about how when he was a student in the classroom growing up in colonial Nigeria, he often thought of Africa in negative terms because there were novels or publications or narratives about Africa that presented Africans almost as savage and barbaric. You know, so maybe examples would be something like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was published by, you know, a Polish person who became an English, you know, a Polish migrant who became an English, who's one of the most important figures in European literature, Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness, the title was meant to represent Africa because Africa was supposed to be a continent of darkness. So, for example, some professor of history called Hugh Trevor Roper in Oxford, 1952 or 2, had said that Africa is a continent of darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. You know, so people like Chinua Achebe came up with Things Fall Apart, saying, look, I'm going to write a story about Africa, about the Igbo people of Nigeria, about Africa, which will show that we were not savages, we were not brutes, we were not, you know, we were not uncivilized, we were not pagans. And that is one of the ways in which you can look at African literature as a body of work that is speaking back to all these misrepresentations of Africa, you know, European writing. Don't forget that in terms of Europe's encounter with Africa, before Africans were colonized, they sent in explorers. So you probably had names like David Livingstone and Mungo Park, you know, and even in the West Indies, people like Christopher Columbus. These people came in and all of them wrote travelers' tales and narratives about Africa, and that they sent back to the Western, you know, superiors. And in all of those narratives, they represented Africans as inferior, as backward, you know, so almost in terms of presenting the African as somebody who was a civilizational inferior of the West. So the West now had come to teach Africa history or literature. And one of the points that African literature is making is that we had our own literature long before we were colonized by Europe. Or we had a system. We had systems of worship. We had, you know, structures of society. We had different things that showed that we were a fully self-contained society. So African literature is engaged in something that we can also describe as a decolonizing project. The fact that Africans had their own way of life, their own versions of life, the way in which they lived and expressed themselves as a people before Europe came in to colonize them. Because the narrative that came after the contact of Europe with Africa was to present Africa as a place that was in need of Europe's spiritual grace or salvation. And these writers were trying to say that, no, that is not the case, you know. So, for example, in the novel Things Fall Apart that was written in 1958 by Chinua Achebe, which is the most popular African novel worldwide, Things Fall Apart. At the very end of that narrative, there's a district commissioner. You know, a district commissioner is somebody who comes into colonial Africa, who is a member of the administrative team of, you know, the dominant or the colonizing power. And he says, I'm going to write a novel about the pacification of the primitive tribes of the Niger.
Okay.
Primitive tribes. But that character in that book and that statement that is made is in a novel where prior to that point in time, it has shown that these people are not primitive.
Sure.
They have a system of agriculture. They have a system of recreation. They have a system of worship. They have legal system, judicial systems. You know, they have culture. They speak. They say, for example, among the Igbo, proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. The art of conversation is highly regarded. And so, prior to the district commissioner making that statement at the end, you know, where Okonkwo, who's a character in the, when we get into the details of the novel, maybe in another program we can talk about that. The district commissioner says he's going to write a story about the primitive tribes, but there's nothing primitive about the society that he says. So why that passage is inserted in the novel is to show that that is the judgment of somebody who is writing about Africa but misrepresenting Africa. Okay. So to that extent, African literature is part of that project of presenting an African story from the perspective of Africa rather than from the perspective of Europe. Okay. Because what Europe does is that it establishes itself as the center. Okay. So everything that is not Europe or European, or everything that is not white or that is not Caucasian becomes the other. Or
savagery.
It represents savagery. So they say, we are Europe, you are Africa. We are civilized, you are uncivilized. We are civilized, you are barbaric. We are Christian, you are pagan. We are superior, you are inferior. And literature came in, or comes in, even before it came in, exists to show that that is not true, that is not the case. Okay. But is that the person who's in control of the narrative, the person who is telling the story. You know, there's this thing about until lions begin to tell their own story, the hunter will always glorify himself in the narrative, or something like that. Yeah. So it's also a moment in which literature was used as a mode of empowering Africans. Okay. And the diaspora connection here, because I know you're very interested in that connection, is that when the people of African descent in the diaspora hear this and read these kinds of stories, they become more confident in themselves. Because don't forget that when you're growing up in New York, or you're growing up in London, or you're growing up in some other part of the world, sometimes you are seeing, you know, images on Western television showing a war-torn Africa.
Even in their museums.
Children with bloated bellies and sunken eyes, hungry people. Or you are seeing the Africa of, you know, aid. You know, the West is always coming to give Africa aid because we are so poor and hungry. But that's not true, because, I mean, we've got gold, we've got diamond, we've got bauxite, you know, we've got cocoa, you know, everything. So how come we who have all these resources, we are the ones who are represented as third world? And that's another thing that comes in. So when literature filters through the imagination of the children of the Africa and the diaspora, and they know these stories about themselves, they hear these histories, it makes them realize that, oh, okay, in our educational system, what we were taught in America in the schools, because a lot of those schools don't teach them about African cultures and civilizations. And when they do, they make sure that they teach that it's a savage, barbaric space. But when they read and hear these narratives, they realize, oh, okay, our people are a great people. So they hear stories of, you know, Yasantua, the great, you know, Asante Queen, or they hear of Queen Nzinga of Angola, you know, or maybe even they hear stories of Shaka Zulu, or they hear, you know, stories of Queen Nani in Jamaica, or Kujo and Achampon. They hear all these stories, and then they're like, oh, wow, okay, so actually we are not what we are being represented as, because the children of Africa in the diaspora just happen to be there because of slavery and transplantation and forced removal, but the heritage is African. And when you experience racism as an African in the West, you know, You know, when the policeman that is, you know, you heard this whole thing about I can't breathe and George Floyd and all of that. But when you have all this brutalization and degradation, you know, and dehumanization of Africans in the West, they don't look at your skin color and see whether you are from continental Africa or if you are from diaspora Africa, or whether you are African American. All they know is that you are black, and they hate you because you are black, and they feel superior to you because they are white. It's a kind of Caucasian mentality. So it's good for that literature to bring the people of the continent and the diaspora together in that sense, and let them realize that we have a common history, we have a common ancestry, you know. And so that's one of the things that...
So, Doc, all this is looking at re-indoctrinating the diasporans to accept that Africa is not as it is being represented in the literature that they were taught. But then, you in the space of contemporary African literature, do you accept literature that is written by a Westerner to say that Africa is not what it's being represented with?
Re-indoctrinating, you know, the people in the diaspora is a very good way of putting it, but also you want to say re-educating, because precisely what the people have done from the West is to indoctrinate us and, you know, misconscientize us into thinking that we are inferior. Now, when you've read a novel like Heart of Darkness, where it talks about traveling up the river Congo, and the river Congo, which is representing Africa, is a very violent, turbulent river. And in that same novel, it's talking about the river Thames, and the river Thames is represented as very tranquil and very calm and very peaceful. Or when the narrator, you know, Kwadwo Malo or whoever it is in Heart of Darkness comes to Africa, and the Africans in there are not fully formed human beings, but they are objects. They are making baboonic sounds. They're just clapping. They're just making... The writer describes the Africans in Heart of Darkness as representing some incomprehensible frenzy. But then you have a narrative that's a narrative by an European on Africa, right? But you have a narrative by an African, Things Fall Apart, where the very first sentence of the novel is, Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. And it talks about him wrestling and overthrowing Amalinze the cat, you know, in a fight which has been as fierce as the one that happened since the founder of the town wrestled the spirits of the wild. One novel is representing Africans as savage and barbaric. Another is representing an African who can be seen to be present in historical time, an African who's part of a community. You understand? And so, for that reason, you're not going to accept the narratives of Europeans on Africa. Even today, as we sit here, there's the Africa of Europe and there's the Africa of Africa.
Okay.
And in African studies, and when you interact with a lot of, you know, European supremacists, let me put it that way, they always want to give you their version of Africa. And that's the version that they're comfortable with. They don't want to give you, or they are discomforted by the version of Africa that is coming from an African perspective. So it's that way. Okay, right. The Africa that is exploited by Europe, and the Africa that wants to assert itself to be independent. All right. We still have that even today.
Okay.
Even
so I think we will go for a quick break, and when we come, we will talk about then what is the role of African writers in continuing this story of Africa. All right. So viewers, this is Diaspora Connect on AAU TV. We are looking at the exposure of the African diaspora through contemporary African literature. So we've been in discussion with Dr. Osei, who has been enlightening us on some of the issues relating to African literature and how the West has misrepresented Africa in ways that we need to change the narrative. Stay with us. We will come back very soon.
ASU, Presbyterian University College, Ghana. Call us or visit our website for more info.
Welcome back. This is Diaspora Connect. Doc, please, before we left off, I was bringing in the issue of what African writers have to do to shape the story. But before we go to that, let me quote this thing by a popular professor, something he wrote about African and African literature. So he said that, and I quote, "I gave up African studies because I found it depressing. I was depressed both by what was happening to African people and by my inability even to explain it adequately, let alone do anything about it." First of all, do you find African history through literature, the way they portray Africa, do you find it depressing? And would you say that by what he's saying here, that African, and by my inability even to explain it adequately, does he speak about the inadequacies of African writers in terms of portraying Africans in literature?
I think that the quotation has to be put in its broader context before we can know what exactly, but you can gather that perhaps the professor sounded exasperated about the fact that there was so much misrepresentation of Africa, and maybe he or she didn't even know where to start to begin to, redress the issue. And talking about depression, maybe I'm presuming it had to do with the fact that there's so many negative images that are presented of Africa in the literature, in colonial literature.
Okay.
There's a whole, you go to King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard, represents Gagul as a witch. The African woman, the prominent African woman in there is a witch. So, Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson, which was one of the novels that Chinua Achebe reacted to, presents Africans as people who are not fully formed in terms of their thinking, And so I think if it's about the negativity that is associated with Africa, then obviously somebody who's concerned or who knows the truth in terms of Africa not being a continent of darkness, but Africa actually being the leading light, because Africa is where civilization started, and there's evidence to that effect, that civilization started in Africa. For a very long time, when Africa was civilized and developed, different parts of Africa, Europe was a wild, wild bush. But then that image has been inverted and, transplanted on Africa instead. And so that is it. But the whole thing is that African writers are engaged in this decolonizing agenda, to prove to the people who have misrepresented the people of the continent, or the continent and its inhabitants, and then its extended kith and kin, the diaspora, that we have our own stories to tell. So we must tell our own stories. And that is a project that African writers are largely engaged in. And when you tell your own stories, of course, every society has its bad and good sides. Every society has its negative. But the thing is, you wonder why there's such an obsession, such a fixation on presenting things that are negative to do with the continent, which is not to say that it's a perfect scenario here. But at least, what about the beauty of life, the beauty of culture? The knowledge, the intelligence of the men and the women, the singing, the dancing, the different aspects of the very beautiful culture that people fall in love with when they actually get to know Africa and know Africa. So it's about exposing the multiplicity of African life in all its very different, energetic, interesting forms. Africa is a place that is full of energy. Maybe partly to do with the sun that we have that gives a lot of energy, so we are very vibrant, dynamic people, and it reflects in what we do, in the things that we do, in our creative ability, in our potential. Every culture within Africa has numerous beautiful stories and tales. So different languages, different cultures, but there's so much brilliance in terms of, stories about, fishing, about hunting, about the origins of the community, about any and everything. Africans have very many good. And so it's a place which has a lot of potential, and in which the vitality of life is ever present. And so I think one of the things that these writers are doing in that sense, and by the way, the writers are just a very tiny aspect of it. We get it through our music as well.
Okay.
You know, and let me give you an example. You have somebody like Christopher Columbus. If anybody knows about Christopher Columbus, the West celebrates Christopher Columbus as the founder of the New World. You know, the person who discovered, you know, the Spanish islands, you know, the Caribbean, you know, Jamaica, etc. But then you have people, storytellers, coming out of Africa in the form of reggae musicians.
Sure.
Christopher Columbus is a damn blasted liar. You know, he said he was the one who discovered Africa. I know 2 black men who were there before him. Or you have another one said, they never won Christopher Columbus in Italy. They never won Christopher Columbus in Spain. How come he come West Indies land about that we? How come he come to take our own thief? And he actually calls Christopher Columbus a thief. And this is somebody who's actually a victim of European colonization and is presenting a story from his perspective. And so you realize that even not just the literature is part of, it's just a part of our bigger narrative resource base. So even in our music, in our performance, in our drama, in our theater, you have all these counter narratives which are challenging and contesting the narratives of the West and of Europe that have represented Africans as inferior beings or as a place of an inferior civilization. You understand? But I don't think there's more work to be done.
Okay.
There's more work to be done in terms of that.
If I listen to you, how you present the issues of how Africa has been misrepresented, it supposes to me that a lot of people are so passionate to tell the story of Africa in a way that will incite people to think that Africa is not what it has been misrepresented with. So in terms of our diasporans who are out there and they want to come back to Africa, already they've heard a lot about Africa in terms of how Africa is such a place that even if you come, the next day you will die of malaria or a disease.
All those stories.
And you know, these are stories that are told about Africa. And so as in literature, how do you portray all these things? How do you turn people's mind to think that there are a lot of opportunities in Africa for the diasporans to explore?
You know, when you one of the ways in which this stereotyping of Africa, you know, as a place of sickness and death happens is through the media presently in the West, and they like to capture those parts. So, for example, if there's war in some part of the continent, they like to show, you know, people who are really suffering and all of that. But you see, the thing that our literature does is just to show the simplicity and the beauty of African life. And when you read the novels, whether they are criticizing the colonialist or whether they begin to talk about the problems that we had at independence where we did not really become a free people, which is another part of the literature which we haven't touched on or not, you just see life going on normally in a beautiful space, in a beautiful place. And we have many works like that by, you know, different African writers from different parts of the continent. You know, you have the Ama Denteh who's from Ghana, you have the Buche Machetas from Nigeria, you have the Ngugi wa Thiongos from Kenya, you know, you have the Bessie Heads from Southern Africa, Botswana, etc. There's a whole wide array. And even in the diaspora itself, you have people like Toni Morrison, you know, who's written Beloved, a novel about slavery, which has shown, you know, how slavery or the institution of slavery in America brutalized and dehumanized the people of African descent in there, and how they try to rebuild their lives, and the energy and the sense of strength which they do that. So our literature is also representing resistance.
Sure.
Because in that novel, in Toni Morrison's novel, and you know, this is something that we can do. We can have, you talked about part 2, we can actually have 100 parts. Because the literature is so broad and vast,
so broad.
We can keep on talking about it. But in that novel, for example, there's a character called Baby Suggs Holly, and when the people have suffered slavery so much, you know, they're in so much pain, she takes them to a space in the woods, in the clearing, where she tells them to love themselves, to love being black, to be proud, because yonder there, they don't love you. They would rather take out your heart or your eyes rather than. So, again, one of the things that literature does is that we've had people who have been community sustainers and community builders, people, men and women who have actually been with us through the struggle. And even if you take our independence struggle, the civil rights movement in America, the Stokely Carmichaels, the Harlem Renaissance, the fact that people like Marcus Garvey and Du Bois, talked about, Du Bois came and lived and worked in Ghana, under Nkrumah, etc. The fact that you have people like Malcolm X, the fact that you have people like Sojourner Truth, who were fighting over there, writing all these stories, the Phyllis Wheatleys, there's a whole tradition of writing, which even within the diaspora, in terms of, let's use just the space of the New World, American New World, where they write, people like Alice Walker, etc., to pray that, look, we black folk, or people of African descent within the diaspora, we have our own ways of existence, and we're not going to be submerged by this white supremacist agenda. Sure. And it's very important, because when you have people like, some presidents of America writing and representing Africa in very negative terms, using certain very derogatory words about us, those things, well, the continent might be experiencing some problems, but there's enough in our literature, there's enough in our past history to show that we are a very productive, useful, creative, glorious, well-established, organized society. And I'm talking here, when I talk about we, I'm talking about the collective, but also the different parts of the continent that have done that. There's also the fact that even before we came to be divided by these colonialists through, colonial activity and the Berlin Conference, etc., we're kind of one people. So there are all of these things that are there. And even right there in the diaspora, the ancient African presence in America, all these people who now call, the people that maltreat the our African American sisters and brothers in America, and call them immigrants, etc. Africans were in there even before them. That's why you have books like They Came Before Columbus, the ancient African presence in America. The black people were in there before these people came. All these people, the descendants of Donald Trump and all those people, they were all immigrants once upon a time. In fact, they went in there and drove away the Indians. And everywhere that Europe has gone, Europeans have gone, or Euro-Americans or Caucasians or whatever, gone, they've gone in there with force and brutality. That has not been the case. Africans have not done that to, the West in the way that the West has done this to us. So when we tell our stories, show how civilized we are. When people like Sheikh Anta Diop talk about the African origin of civilization, or people like Avan Sentima talks about blacks in science, or people like George James talk about the stolen legacy. Say Africa, Yewazoi.
Look, Doc, I think there's with the discussion going on, I'm quite surprised that myself, I think there's a lot that we, as even those in Africa, really need to even learn about ourselves through literature. But there's so much that I don't know. Sure. I may be sounding like I know, but there's so much that I don't know just because of the kind of educational system that we had. Sure. Growing up, we were being taught to sing Jack Angel went up the hill, or London Bridge is falling down. So even our education alienated us from ourselves. Sure. So it's not just you, even me, who may be the professor at this point in time, sure, in terms of the interview. There's so much that I need to learn about myself and my people. Okay. You understand? So you are absolutely right. All right. And that is why African studies is so relevant. So necessary, because it is within African studies that we excavate and unearth all this knowledge that we are talking about right here. There's so much hidden in there. And so it's not just the mathematics, sure, that is going to help us, or the economics, or the political science, or whatever. Sure. Sometimes when you go to, I remember when we're going to Legon and you say you're going to study English literature. And English literature also, when we went to the university and we studied English literature, we did African literature as part of it. But people say, literature, what are you going to do with literature? What are you going to do with African studies? Almost like, but that is it. That is where the core, our soul, and even of course, is our Agenda 2063. If you look at all the 7 aspirations, you find out that everything is centered around Africans rediscovering our own identity. But when we use it as a conduit to development. When they talked about the year of return last year, yeah, when you're returning to your homeland, you need to know the place that you're returning to. What it is that it has to offer you. Good. What is it that has been missing? What have you lost in terms of your own identity because of your forced removal to the West and establishment of a different home over there? Sure. So how has it been to be so many years away? I remember
Malcolm X came to, from America, he went through Nigeria, came to Ghana, and then he said something in an interview somewhere about, I read something that he said about, oh, I went back to Nigeria, and then the Nigerians told me my name is Omowale, which means the child has returned. And I was so happy because I've been away for 400 years or more or whatever, but I'm back home. So it doesn't matter how long you've been away from Africa in terms that that's why Peter touched. He said, where will you come from? Once you're a black man, once you're a black woman, you're an African.
So what Africa is you finally say to the diasporans who are out there for a very long
come
time?
Home.
Brother,
sister, come home.
Okay.
This is a song by Baniwela. Talks about Africans coming home. And people like Burning Seer speaking African teacher. So even within the diaspora, which has been a site of resistance, there are people who have knowledge about Africa and know what the continent has to offer. I mean, imagine what the continent would be like if we have, you know, us in charge of ourselves rather than having people always determine for us what to do on our own space. Like I come in here today for this interview and I begin to tell you, Schenineda, what to do. I mean, what's the meaning of that? You understand? I have to come and learn from you because this is your space.
Sure.
And that's what the power of our literature and our creativity, our creative arts and everything. And that's the sense of community and the sense of bonding that we have with the diaspora, that you have to come home and strengthen it. But also that process means unlearning a lot of the things. There's a play by Ama Denteh called The Dilemma of a Ghost, in which Yuleli Rush, an African-American woman, marries Kwadwo Osei-Nyame and they come to Ghana. That play explores some of these issues about coming home.
Sure.
Because sometimes you are coming home, you have a different idea, you come home with something different.
Sure.
But all of these things, but the thing is that the literature and also the sense of community, because one of the things that African study does is not just about the study and the scholarship, but it's also about having a sense of civic and social engagement and how all of these things that we're talking about can be transformed into real life existence to help us develop. So sometimes when they talk about development, people talking development economics. And it's all about that. And oftentimes they're reading the books by some professor who talks about some millennium. What about the Africans who know about development, who went through it? What about the Amilcar Cabrals, who was an agronomist in the whole of Guinea and Cape Verde, who studied his society and knew it that well? Well, what about, you know, the different people, Steve Biko and others? What do they know about their own continent? And what does that, so there's a lot within our literature and, you know, within our culture that can help us deal with the issues that we have to deal with as a people, you know, on the continent, but also dispersed. And which will just make us stronger together.
All right. Thank you very much, Doc, for this insight. I think, like you ended it, there is a lot that we need to learn when it comes to this. And I think this show alone cannot explore all the things. And I think it will be interesting that we delve into some of these books and then the lessons that it teaches us out there. And if you're in the diaspora, this is a call for you to come home. There is a lot, and then you have to come home to experience all these things. This is Diaspora Connect. Our guest today was Dr. Kwadwo Osei-Nyame Jnr., who has given us a lot on the African literature and how we need to tell our story as Africans. I'm sure you enjoyed this show, and I'm sure you'll stay with us in subsequent versions. Thank you for today. I was your host, Schenineda Kwaku Ankomah.